Hello and welcome once again to our Ourdadsstamps video. For today's video I thought I'd talk about the Great British Queen Elizabeth stamps, the pre-decimal ones, that's up to 1971. And these were actually the stamps of my childhood. I remember these were the start of my collection, if you like, and as I was growing up these were the stamps that I was familiar with and still look back on now with some fondness. So I thought it'd be a good topic to talk about, and there's quite a lot of interesting things to look at when talking about Queen Elizabeth stamps, so let's have a look. The first set that was produced after Queen Elizabeth came to the throne were the definitive Wilding set. I would like to think most people are familiar with the Wilding set. These were based on a photograph done by Dorothy Wilding and used various designs to produce a set of 17 stamps which ran from a halfpenny up to 1 and 6pence. When collecting the Wildings, there are actually 7 different sets that you can collect, so there's an awful lot of variation. And within most of those sets, there are various watermark variations as well. So there's an awful lot to look at just on the Wildings itself. The first set produced in 1952-53 were with the Tudor crown watermark on the back. And as I said before, these ran from a halfpenny up to 1 and 6pence. And it's a nice set to collect. Mint, they are beginning to get a little expensive. The whole set catalogues now at about £100. So it's not necessarily cheap, but it's not hugely expensive either. And in used format, they're much easier to get hold of. In 1955, they changed the watermark to St Edward's Crown watermark. And once again, the stamps were the same, running from a halfpenny up to 1 and 6. There were 2 different twopenny stamps, so there was the darker brown and also a lighter brown was introduced. And these tend to be listed separately, so that makes it 18 in that set rather than 17. And this particular set is where it gets a bit expensive, so it proves that it's definitely worth checking the watermarks. The St Edward's Crown set complete mint is catalogued at £160, and yet only £20 if they're used. So as I said before, to get hold of the Wildings used is very easy, and you can pick up bags and bags of Wildings used for pennies. And it's a good way to start, to have a look through and see which different watermarks you've got. But mint, as I said, especially these St Edward's Crown ones, the catalogue value is £160 for the whole set, so you need to spend a little bit of money there. A couple of years later, the post office experimented with ways of automating the postage sorting, and they introduced the lower values with graphite lines on the back. These show up as just 2 black lines on the halfpenny, penny halfpenny, 2.5 halfpenny and 3 stamp, and on the twopenny stamp is just 1 black line on the back. And I'm not quite sure the reason why they changed from 2 graphite lines to 1 graphite line for that particular stamp. But anyway, there's 6 stamps there to collect with graphite lines on the back, and again, not particularly expensive. These are catalogued at £14. So again, reasonably easy to get hold of. But a word of caution here, there were actually 3 different sets produced with graphite lines, so you have to have a look not just at the graphite lines but also the watermarks and other features, which we'll talk about in a minute. The next set to be produced was in 1958, where once again they changed the watermark on the paper to just multiple crowns. Now this is the really common set. This is the set that were in use for almost 10 years, and so the value of these is reflected in this, and the whole set would only catalogue at £9. So these ones are very, very easy to get hold of, and if you're just interested in having 1 set of Wildings, this is the one to go for because they're the cheapest ones. Following on from the original experiment with graphite lines, they did the same thing with the multiple crown set. So you've got a set of stamps with graphite lines with St Edward's Crown watermark, and you've got a set of stamps with graphite lines with the multiple crowns watermark. Now the ones with multiple crowns are slightly unusual. Once again, they're quite cheap, with the exception of the penny halfpenny. And the penny halfpenny green catalogues at £90 mint and £80 used. That obviously wasn't printed very much for some reason or another, but all the others are just a few pounds, slightly more expensive than the ordinary multiple crown set, but you should be able to get hold of those reasonably easy. But just look out for the penny halfpenny one, because it's well worth getting hold of. One last thing they did to the Wilding set was to add phosphor bands to them. Again, this was after experiments to automate the postage sorting, and it was eventually decided to use phosphor bands. So in 1959 they produced a set with graphite lines on the back and phosphor bands on the front. This ran from a halfpenny up to fourpence halfpenny, just 8 stamps, the low value ones. And this particular set catalogues at about £100 just for those 8 stamps. And then finally in 1960 they produced the whole set with phosphor bands on them. And once again, this set is very easy to get hold of and not particularly expensive. For all 17 stamps, the catalogue is only a tenner. So again, an easy set to get hold of. Within all of those, except the graphite line issues, you also need to look at the orientation of the watermarks. Now, the stamps you could buy over the counter at the post office had the normal upright watermark, be it Tudor crown, St Edward's crown or multiple crowns. However, with each of those, for the low value stamps, you could also buy them in booklets or from a machine in coils. So you get stamps that were produced in booklets had the inverted watermark, and stamps that you could buy from machines in coils had the sideways watermark. As you can see, just collecting Wildings, there's an awful lot that you can collect. 7 different sets or part sets, and then within those there's the sideways watermark and the inverted watermark sets as well. So it's a huge collection, and that's before you feature in the actual printing errors, of which there are a few. So you could spend a lifetime just collecting Wildings. They're certainly nice stamps. Whether that's a bit of nostalgia talking or not, I'm not so sure, but I do like looking at them, and I have had almost all of them at some point or another. Recently I decided to rationalise my stamp collecting and specialise just in Victorian Britain. So I have now sold all my Queen Elizabeth stamps, but it's still nice to look at them occasionally. The next set that came out with a coronation issue, which is 4 stamps. Twopence halfpenny, fourpence, 1 and threepence and 1 and sixpence. Each with slightly different designs, a very nice looking set, and quite cheap, as almost all of the commemorative sets from Queen Elizabeth's era. They're not difficult to get hold of. They're not particularly expensive for a catalogue value of around about a tenner. So, yeah, easy enough to get hold of and a good looking set. The next one to really talk about, though, is the high value castle set. These were first produced in 1955. And had the same portrait by Dorothy Wilding on the side and different castles in the centre as a feature. The 2 and sixpence had Carrickfergus Castle, the 5 shilling had Carnarvon Castle, the 10 shilling had Edinburgh Castle, and the £1 had Windsor Castle. Now, once again, this is a set with lots of different printings and different variations, and depending on which one you got, the value varies hugely, so it is worth spending a time sorting them out and trying to distinguish between them. The first set in 1955 had the St Edward's Crown watermark, and this set mint is the ones to get hold of because they have the biggest value. However, there is an added difficulty in that there were 2 printings made, one by De La Rue and one by Waterloo. And the De La Rue set mint is catalogued at £600. The Waterloo set at £250. So there's a big difference between the two. Unfortunately, it's very, very difficult to tell the difference between the two. There are slight differences in the colours, there are slight differences in the quality of the printing, and there are very slight differences between the horizontal gutters. But to be honest, this is one I have found really difficult to distinguish, and in order to make sure I had both sets, I actually bought those that were already sorted. There are details given in most catalogues, or certainly the specialist catalogues, of distinguishing features. But as I said, I couldn't rely on my ability to distinguish between the two, so be very careful when buying them that you know you're getting the right type. Like with the Wilding Definitives, in 1959 they reproduced the set but with a multiple crowns watermark. And once again, these were produced by two printers, De La Rue and Bradbury Wilkinson. And once again, there's a huge difference in value between the two. The De La Rue set catalogue at £195, £200. The Bradbury Wilkinson set, £15. So a big difference once again. These are, however, slightly easier to tell the difference between the two. Once again, there are differences between the colours, particularly the blue is fairly obvious which is which. But the one clue that I was given that makes this so much easier is if you breathe on the paper or put them carefully on a radiator and they heat up, the paper curls. And because of the way the paper was laid out, they curl differently. The De La Rue set curl from top to bottom, so the top and the bottom curl inwards. On the Bradbury Wilkinson set, they curl from side to side. So it's quite easy if you heat them up, whether you use a hairdryer, whether you use a radiator, whether you just breathe on them and see which way they curl, then it's pretty foolproof which stamp you've got. Finally, in 1967, the set was produced once again, this time with no watermark. And this is the cheapest set of the lot. The catalogue value is just over £10 on these, so easy to get hold of and a nice addition to your collection very cheaply. During this period, the Post Office issued many commemorative sets, and like most countries in the late 50s and early 60s, there weren't that many. For example, there were only two commemorative sets in 1960. This was the Letter Office Tercentenary and the Ourdadsstamps. By 1965, 1966, they produced 9 different sets. So the issues were increasing by that stage, but still not to the huge volumes that they are now, and still very collectible. Almost all these commemorative sets are reasonably cheap. You can pick them up for a few pounds in most cases. However, again, there are variations from 1962 onwards. That was the National Productivity Year set. These were produced in ordinary paper and paper with phosphor lines on them. And that occurred right up till 1967. Every set you can buy with phosphor bands or ordinary paper. And some of the early sets, the phosphor bands issue, are quite substantially different. For example, the National Productivity Year set that I just mentioned, with ordinary paper, a catalogue value of £1 for the whole set. With phosphor lines, the catalogue value is £35. The National Lifeboat Conference set, again, on ordinary paper, the catalogue value is £1.50. With phosphor lines on them, it's £48. And finally, the Red Cross Centenary, £2.50 for the ordinary set, and £65 with phosphor bands. This is the mint value. So it's definitely worth looking out for the phosphor bands, especially on the early sets. So in amongst all that, it's worth looking carefully for it and getting a specialist catalogue to give you the pricing between the two. Because some of the sets, there is very little difference in the value, and other sets there's a big difference in the value. The Shakespeare set from 1964, it's £2 for the ordinary and £4 for the phosphor set. So there really is not much difference. But the Botanical in Congress set, which is a really nice set by the way, I really like the look of those. It's £2 on the ordinary set, £30 for the set with phosphor bands. So have a look out for the phosphor bands and maybe collect both. I tried to do that, but it was very difficult in a lot of cases to get hold of the phosphor band sets because I was collecting in blocks of 4 rather than individual stamps. There are a lot of very nice commemoratives at this time, and very memorable ones for me as well. As I said, these are the stamps from my childhood. The Battle of Britain set in 1965 are very striking. And unusually at that time, you had a block of 6 different stamps which you could collect. And obviously they looked much better in a block than they do individually. Similarly, there was a set of British birds in 1966, again, which came in a block of 4 different stamps. And the Battle of Hastings anniversary, there was a strip of 6 stamps, 6 different stamps, which again looks much better as a strip than they do individually. In actual fact, I collected that as half a sheet or a quarter of a sheet because it looked much better than just one individual strip, and it's very difficult to keep one individual strip in a strip because they tear quite easily. So yeah, I went for bigger blocks, but obviously that's a personal preference. In 1967, the Wildings finally gave way to a new set of definitive stamps, which are the now famous Machins. For the time, these were very, very on trend. They were quite plain, simple, and effective. I'm still not convinced that I like them, to be honest. I think I prefer the Wildings. However, the set was produced in stages over a few years, but it ran from a halfpenny up to 1 9/9. It's very, very cheap to get hold of. The whole set catalogues only at £2, so as I said, they're easy to get hold of and a good addition. The last pre-decimal set of stamps issued in Britain was the 1970 Christmas stamps. In my view, not particularly inspiring set, but certainly something you need to get hold of if you want to get the whole range of pre-decimal stamps. For me, this was probably one of the better periods of British stamps. Now, as I've said before, that very possibly is to do with nostalgia. This was during my childhood when everything was new and exciting and my collection was still in its infancy, but certainly an area to look at and one that's not expensive to collect. Stamp collecting was very popular, and I should imagine most British people my age know these stamps and at one stage possibly collected these stamps. So there's lots of them out there and lots of them to get hold of. But as I've mentioned, there's lots of variations and lots of different things to look for. And we haven't even mentioned all the errors that were on these stamps throughout the time. If you're into varieties and errors, then there are specialist catalogues, and the Stanley Gibbons specialist catalogue is well worth getting hold of if that's your thing, and certainly makes it very interesting to collect. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed that little trip into my childhood and a look at the early stamps of Queen Elizabeth. Thank you for watching, and see you again in a few weeks' time. Thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. Don't forget you can visit my online stores at eBay and Delcamp under the name of Ourdadsstamps, where I have over 2,000 items for sale. Please join us again in 2 weeks' time for another edition of Ourdadsstamps podcast.